Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you're well. My name is Alex, and this is Slumbertime Podcast. Before getting into the meat of today's episode, I'd like to take a look at a chart that is going to give us some background on today's topic. Many of you have never heard of the pyramid of discrimination and hate, I'm guessing. It goes by a few other names, but that is the one that I am most familiar with. I find that this is an absolutely necessary tool for discussing about racism or any other type of prejudice because so many people consider discrimination to be blatant. What they don't understand is that there are multiple levels of discrimination and that many people are unaware of how their actions are discriminating against others. I know that I am at fault for some of these, especially before living abroad, but I'll get into that a bit more later. In this pyramid, the different levels, as you can see, are biased attitudes. These are the most basic forms of discrimination that most people are unaware of. This includes stereotyping, being afraid of other people, some microaggressions. Even staring at people because they're different from you is exclusive. Acts of bias is the next. This is when the attitudes and the microaggressions become more blatant. This is the bullying, the belittling language, the slurs, even avoiding people. Every foreigner in Japan has had the experience of other Japanese not wanting to sit next to them on the train. That seat is almost always the last one to be taken. Next up is systemic discrimination. This includes situations like segregation, of course, but there are also disparities in resources, employment opportunities, voting restrictions, criminal justice. For example, requiring an ID to vote may sound reasonable until you realize that it is a law made to keep minorities from voting. For Japan, if you live in a certain neighborhood, buraku neighborhoods especially, your chances of employment go down. Also, you have to use a picture when applying for jobs, so employers are then biased based on that as well. Bias-motivated violence is the second from the top. This is the most stereotypical type of discrimination in which people attack others for being different. It includes rape, murder, threats, vandalism, and so on. And finally, at the very top is genocide. This is probably the most obvious one in which one group of people will try to eradicate another group for being different. So, that's what we'll be looking at today. I think that this is a necessary discussion for Japan to have, and even with the Black Lives Matter movement going on, many people can't see the problems that are happening within Japan. I have heard so often from my clients that there is no racism in Japan. Many of my clients at work will say so, but this pyramid has helped open up their eyes a bit. So for today, I'd like to give some personal stories as well as some statistics and real-life examples in regards to each of these points. I also want to say before getting too far into this that I'm a white man and that each country will have different issues in regards to discrimination. I can't say that I understand the racism in America very well. I never had to worry about my skin color then, and I absolutely cannot and will not compare my experience being the minority in Japan with being a minority in America. However, since coming to Japan, since becoming a minority, I can now say that I've been through some situations that classify as racist. Now that I got that out of the way, let's look at the biased attitudes level first. I've already mentioned that so many people in Japan will stare at you for not being Asian or even Japanese. Japan is about 98% Japanese, while the other 2% are foreign nationals living in the country. So you're less likely to see people from overseas outside of the big cities, but even then, the stares continue. Of course, there is a ton of stereotyping as well. If you ask a Japanese person about a Chinese person, they'll say they're loud and rude. They'll also say Americans are loud, fat, and rude. Those are obviously stereotypes that exist in quite a few countries, but Japan is not different in that way. Even just in June this year, the Deputy Prime Minister commented that Japan's death rate of COVID-19 is so low because the Japanese have superior genetics to the rest of the world, aka Mindo. This is the very basis of eugenics. He was even told never to use that phrase before the speech, meaning that people knew of this prejudice, but they just want to hide it. Unfortunately, that is a key focus of Japanese culture. It is common to not address issues in the hope that they will just go away. Another example is the hopes to not teach children about Japan's part in World War II. Speaking up about things means that you stick out, and the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. However, due to the high context culture, there is not even a need to directly say these things, because the subtext is already there. And that's why discrimination in Japan is often so hard to see for Japanese, because it's not talked about and often directly connected to the language and the culture. I'll get into that a little bit more later, but I'll also say for any Japanese listening, we know that Japan is an island nation that was shut off from the rest of the world for almost 300 years. We know that there was a ton of big changes since then. Japan opened up at nearly the same time as slavery ended in the US. So there's a lot to get used to. However, that doesn't mean the country has nowhere left to go. The second level up is acts of bias. You can't say there's no discrimination when you're not willing to sit next to a foreigner on the train. There are several clients I'll hear who say they can't stand Koreans or Chinese people. Some even say they hate them with no reason other than that's what they're taught. It's comparable to the propaganda Americans were taught about Germany in World War II or the Russians during the Cold War. There are also quite a few slurs that are used and some that are unknowingly discriminatory. A famous one that was pointed out in another YouTube video by Miki Dezaki, aka Medama-sensei, was bakachon camera. Basically a disposable camera that translates as a camera so easy a dumb Korean can use it. Of course, like most countries, there are slurs like these, but I like to look at some others that many Japanese might not know can hurt people. What about the word haf, or hafu? Let me ask you this. Have you ever heard of a quadroon or mulatto? In America, those who were born with black ancestors were given rights based on how white they were. These are extremely derogatory and should never be used, but it's basically the same meaning. You're basically saying that you're half us and half not. There's so much bullying based on this, and one of my friends told me, I've never felt like a part of anything. I'm not Japanese, and I'm not Brazilian. No matter where I go, I never feel like I'm home. Basically, neither culture is completely accepting of them. Even easier example for people to understand, half is just like in Harry Potter with pure bloods or mudbloods. One more very common example is the word gaijin or gaikokujin. This one is the most used word for anybody who is not Japanese. The translation of it is outside people. It's another way of saying not us. You're telling us that we are excluded from your group, and this word is not very welcoming, to say the least. Those are just a few examples of words that are hurtful. For me, I've had an even more blatant act of discrimination happen. I was sitting with a European friend eating lunch outside when a Japanese man came up to us and told us to go back to America, started bringing up the war. I'd say it was pretty bad, but he was basically singing it to us, so I kind of can't help but laugh at the thought now. Another time, I was called a damn foreigner. So I can't help but think how some minorities feel in America when they're told to go back to their home country. So next up on the list is systemic discrimination. This also exists in Japan to this day. I already mentioned the buraku, basically the untouchables, like in the Indian caste system. This is still a problem in regards to hiring, and was even recognized by the United Nations as an issue that needs to be taken care of. One other specific example of systemic discrimination is my Japanese friend who was born in Japan to two Nigerian parents. Japan attributes citizenship by blood, so he was not given Japanese citizenship when he was born here, and he will have to fight to get it even though he has lived here his entire life. He will never be seen as Japanese either. A few times I was around him, I had to tell others that he's Japanese because they always assume he's an exchange student. However, one of the biggest issues that so many have faced is with apartment complexes. There are quite a few that are literally segregated. You're not allowed to apply for some if you are not Japanese. Some people have tried to apply, but usually a staff will run out waving their arms saying, "No foreigners." The reason for it is basically because of trust. They don't trust that people from overseas will be able to, for example, get a guarantor company to support them, or even pay rent on time. The even more unfortunate fact is that there are no laws banning discrimination in regards to renting apartments. We could go on, but some other I will include are during the coronavirus, some restaurants didn't accept any non Japanese. A news source shared that English speakers will spread the virus faster because of our pronunciation. Foreign teachers are extremely unlikely to get tenure. Crime statistics are manipulated by the media to show foreigners committing more. However, in reality, they commit fewer actual crimes, but are just reported more. Basically, they're being wrongly accused. Also, the fact that there are no penalties in the Constitution for discriminatory actions committed is one thing that needs to be changed in the near future. The list goes on, but it's time I move on to the next and most controversial point: bias motivated violence. This is when Japanese will say, "Oh, that doesn't exist in Japan. It doesn't happen." And I have to agree that it's not nearly as common as America. It's actually quite hard to find anything like that in the news these days whatsoever. The closest thing to this are verbal threats people will receive. However, I recommend to anybody listening to look up on Google the words Japan and genocide. You're going to uncover quite a lot of interesting links about their war crimes and murders that none of us were taught in school. The first that shows up for me is a statistic that states the Japanese military murdered around 6 million people. Remember that 6 million Jews were killed under the Nazi regime. Now, this number is based on those who were POWs, forced laborers, those in massacres, and others. It's hard to say whether these war crimes were based on discrimination, so it's classified more as democide. This is an extremely touchy topic for most Japanese, but these are atrocities. You can never bring up Unit 731 in politics because it's something that they want to sweep under the mat and forget. But more unfortunately, too many politicians, like the current governor of Tokyo, for example, want to erase that from the textbooks and create a nationalistic perspective. That, too, parallels the situation in America in that many people want their children to learn how great their country is instead of the issues that it has. This history needs to be taught and learned from so that the relation between countries can strengthen. This is one reason that people in China and Korea hate Japan so much. There's a list of times the government and emperors have apologized, but the relations are still bad. Japan is infamous for refusing reparations and going back on their apologies. By creating this nationalistic view of the world, you're demonizing others and creating an even worse world for people to live in. For an example of this, you have to look no further than the current Prime Minister and Yasukuni Shrine. Yasukuni Shrine is one of the most famous shrines because every August 15th, thousands of Japanese go to this shrine in remembrance of the end of the war. There, over 1,000 convicted war criminals are enshrined. The current Prime Minister denies the history of Korean comfort women, for example, and denies that what happened were war crimes under Japanese law, as if the Japanese law were infallible. Now, I'll say that even if you're not someone who says anything bad about other races, check the other points too. Something as small as a look can have a big impact on someone. I've made that mistake so many times that I have to keep it at the forefront of my mind in order to avoid making other people feel uneasy or hurt. I've even said things that weren't meant to be racist, but unfortunately were. My most regrettable example was talking with my coworker back while I was in university. He's black, and we ended up having a discussion about how he doesn't trust white people. I immediately made the mistake of saying I'm not like them. I also mentioned my other black friends, like that would matter. He didn't say much, and it took a long time for me to realize what I had done. I basically showed him that I am like the rest and that I'm thinking of myself first. I tried to make him trust me instead of actually listening what he had to say. Moreover, I tried to talk with him about black comedians, for example, just to try to connect with him, and I completely disregarded who he is for the color of his skin. It reminds me too much of the poem we put in the Dreams Deferred episode. Let me read it again here to remind you. It's called Ode to the Only Black Kid in Class by Clint Smith. You, it seems, are the manifestation of several lifetimes of toil. Brown versus bored in the flesh. Most days the classroom feels like an antechamber. You are deemed expert in all things Morrison, King, Malcolm, Rosa. Hell, weren't you sitting on that bus too? You're everybody's best friend until you're not. Hip-hop lyricologist, presumed athlete, free and reduced sideshow, exception and caricature. Too black and too white all at once. If you're successful, it is because of affirmative action. If you fail, it is because you were destined to. You are invisible until they turn on the Friday night lights. Here you are star before they render you asteroid, before they want you turned to dust. I also challenge Japanese people to keep these points in mind. None of us are going to be perfect, and we're all going to make mistakes. But we have the chance to hurt fewer people and learn from, as well as fix, these mistakes. So, thank you. And as always, we're here and we're listening.